Captain Ren Arkafer had flown exactly 4 combat simulations in the past 6 months, and she had failed to be selected for a single live mission in any of them. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself that a lot lately, and it was getting harder to believe. The Threshold Squadron operated out of Kessa Station, a joint military installation shared between Earth's expeditionary forces and the Etheri Combine, built to defend a contested trade corridor that both governments had, after years of tension, finally agreed to protect together rather than fight over separately. The arrangement looked good on paper. In practice, it meant 12 Etheri primary pilots flying the squadron's frontline missions, and 6 human reserve pilots, Ren among them, spending most of their deployment running simulator drills and maintenance rotations, waiting for a call to active duty that 6 months in had never come. "You understand the reasoning," Flight Instructor Ves Carnal told her, not unkindly, during her most recent performance review. He was Etheri, tall and narrow-boned, with the fast, precise movements of a species whose reflexes operated, by every measured baseline the squadron's medical division had recorded, nearly 40% faster than human average. Etheri combat doctrine is built around reaction speed. Our pilots process threat data and execute evasive maneuvers in fractions of a second your physiology cannot match. This is not a criticism, Captain. It is simply a fact of comparative neurology. "I understand the reasoning," Ren said, keeping her voice level with the practiced patience of someone who had heard some version of this conversation at least a dozen times. "I'd just like the chance to prove it doesn't disqualify me from flying." "Your simulator scores are respectable," Carnal said, in the tone of someone offering a consolation prize. "You are, by human standards, an excellent pilot. But this squadron measures its pilots against Etheri standards, because Etheri standards are what this corridor's defense requires. I do not say this to discourage you, Captain. I say it because I believe you deserve honesty rather than false hope." Ren had thanked him because there was nothing else productive to say, and had gone back to the reserve pilot's ready room, where 5 other humans sat in various states of restless, underused frustration. All of them 6 months into a deployment that had so far asked nothing of them except to wait. "Carnal give you the reflex speech again?" asked Petty Officer Milo Drack, the squadron's senior human ground crew chief. Without looking up from the maintenance panel, he was calibrating. He'd flown transport craft himself, years earlier, before an injury had grounded him permanently into ground support work, and he developed, over the deployment, a quiet habit of keeping Ren's assigned fighter in better condition than regulations technically required. "The reflex speech," Ren confirmed, dropping into the seat beside him. 40% faster reaction time, comparative neurology, the whole thing. "He's not wrong about the numbers," Milo said. "Etheri really do process visual threat data faster than we do. Measured fact, not squadron politics." "I know," Ren said. "I just don't think that's the whole equation, and I can't get anyone with the authority to actually let me fly to consider that it might not be." Milo glanced up at her, something thoughtful in his expression. "What's the rest of the equation, in your professional opinion?" Ren considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things about her craft. "Reflex speed wins you the first half-second of a surprise," she said slowly. "After that, it's judgment. It's knowing what to actually do with the information you're reacting to, not just how fast you can react to it. Etheri doctrine is built entirely around that first half-second, because it's what their physiology gives them for free. Human training, real human training, the kind you get flying older equipment with worse sensors and less simulator time than any Etheri cadet ever had to work with, that builds something different. You learn to compensate for what your body can't do naturally. You learn to read a situation 2 steps ahead instead of reacting to it a half-second faster. I think that matters. I just haven't ever gotten a chance to prove it matters, because nobody's ever put me in a position where it would." Milo was quiet for a moment, then went back to his calibration work, though something in his posture suggested he was turning the thought over more seriously than his silence let on. Your fighter's flight systems are in better shape than half the primary pilot's birds, he said eventually. For what it's worth, I keep it that way on my own time, not because regulations require it. Figured somebody ought to be ready on the chance the squadron ever actually needs you. Thanks, Milo, Ren said, and meant it more than the casual words probably conveyed. The attack came without warning, 4 days later, during what should have been a routine patrol rotation. Ren was in the reserve-ready room, running through simulator drills out of habit rather than any expectation they'd matter, when the station's alarms erupted, not the measured tone of a scheduled drill, but the sharp, urgent klaxon reserved for genuine combat emergencies. Unidentified hostile force, multiple contacts, approaching from the corridor's outer perimeter, came the station commander's voice over the emergency channel, tight, with barely controlled urgency. All primary flight crews to launch stations immediately. Ren was on her feet and moving before the announcement finished, following the same instinct that had carried her through years of training, even without any real expectation she'd be called to use it. She reached the hangar deck, in time to see chaos she hadn't anticipated, not the calm, disciplined scramble the squadron's drills had always modeled, but something considerably worse. A secondary explosion, somewhere deep in the station's power distribution network, had knocked out primary launch control for 6 of the squadron's 12 Etheri fighters, trapping their pilots in disabled cockpits with launch systems that wouldn't respond. Squadron leader Dara Iyun, one of the 6 affected, was shouting orders over the emergency channel with the controlled fury of someone watching half her command get taken out of the fight before it had even begun, while medical teams worked frantically to extract 2 more pilots injured in the explosion's initial blast radius. We have 8 confirmed hostile contacts inbound, came the station's tactical update, and functional launch capacity for exactly 4 fighters. Ren looked at the hangar deck around her, 5 other reserve pilots, all human, all watching the chaos with the same stunned uncertainty she felt, and 6 functional Etheri fighters whose pilots were either injured, trapped, or scrambling toward launch stations that wouldn't be ready in time to matter. Captain Arkafa, came Flight Instructor Carnel's voice over her calm, tighter and less composed than she had ever heard it. Your fighter is combat-ready and cleared for immediate launch. Squadron Leader Iyun has authorized reserve pilot deployment. This is not a drill. Ren didn't have time to feel vindicated. She was already running toward her assigned fighter, where Milo Drax stood at the boarding ramp, having clearly anticipated the order before it was even given. She's ready, Milo said, as Ren swung into the cockpit. Every system's green. I told you somebody ought to be ready. Thank you, Ren said, already running through her launch checklist with the fast, practiced efficiency of someone who had run this exact sequence in simulation hundreds of times without ever once expecting to need it for real. Ren, Milo said, before sealing the canopy, something urgent in his voice. You've got this. Whatever Carnel's been telling you for 6 months, you've got this. The engagement that followed would, in the following weeks, become the subject of extensive tactical analysis across both the Etheri Combine's military command and Earth's expeditionary fleet. Studied and restudied for lessons neither force had fully anticipated needing to learn. Ren launched alongside 3 other reserve pilots and the 6 Etheri fighters that managed to clear the damaged launch bays in time, into a hostile formation considerably better coordinated than the station's initial sensor readings had suggested, 8 heavily armed raiders moving in a tight, disciplined attack pattern that made immediately clear this was no opportunistic strike, but a deliberate, planned assault. Formation Delta, Squadron Leader Iyun ordered over the combined tactical channel, her voice tight with pain from injuries she was clearly working through rather than around. Etheri fighters take lead intercept. Reserve pilots hold defensive position around the station's primary shield generators. It was, Ren understood immediately, exactly the assignment her 6 months of dismissal had prepared her to expect a defensive holding position safely removed from the engagement's sharpest edge, the kind of role that let the squadron technically deploy its reserve pilots without actually trusting them with anything that mattered. She held the position anyway because orders were orders, and watched, over the following several minutes, as the Aetheri fighters' engagement began to unravel in ways their doctrine hadn't prepared them for. The raiders, Ren realized as she watched the engagement pattern develop, weren't fighting the way standard hostile forces fought. They weren't relying on raw speed or aggressive maneuvering that Aetheri reflexes could counter through pure reaction time. They were fighting with patient, coordinated deception, feinting toward one target, drawing a rapid Aetheri response, then exploiting the split-second overcommitment that response created to strike somewhere else entirely. "Iyun, break left, you're being baited," Ren called over the tactical channel, watching the pattern develop 2 full seconds before the Aetheri squadron leader's own sensors flagged the threat. "I have this, reserve pilot," Iyun snapped back, breaking right instead, directly into the feint Ren had just warned her away from, and took a glancing hit to her fighter's rear shield array that sent her spiraling momentarily out of formation. Ren watched the pattern repeat twice more over the following minute, Aetheri pilots reacting with blistering speed to each individual threat as it materialized, and being systematically outmaneuvered by an enemy that had clearly studied exactly how Aetheri reflex-based doctrine worked, and built an entire attack strategy around exploiting its blind spots. "They're not testing our reactions," Ren said, working through the pattern out loud, partly to herself and partly to the other reserve pilots holding position beside her. "They're testing our patience. Every Aetheri fighter is reacting to the threat directly in front of them as fast as they possibly can, which means they're never looking 2 moves ahead because their doctrines never had to. I don't think fast reactions are what beats this. I think reading the pattern is what beats this." "Reserve pilots are ordered to hold defensive position," came Carnal's voice, tense and distracted, clearly monitoring the deteriorating engagement from the station's tactical center. "With respect, Instructor," Ren said, already adjusting her fighter's heading, "I think I can help if you'll let me." There was a pause, brief, but Ren understood, in the charged silence that followed, exactly how much 6 months of dismissal was weighing against whatever decision Carnal was about to make. "Squadron leader Iyun is down 2 fighters and taking damage on a 3rd, Carnal said finally, his voice tight. "Deploy at your own discretion, Captain Akafa. I am revising my prior assessment in real time, and I do not have the luxury of doing so carefully." Ren broke formation and moved into the engagement with the same patient, methodical approach she'd spent years developing in older simulators, on less advanced equipment, precisely because she'd never had the luxury of trusting raw reflex speed to carry her through a fight the way Aetheri doctrine trusted it. She watched the raiders' formation for a full 3 seconds before committing to any maneuver, an eternity by Aetheri combat standards, but exactly the interval she needed to confirm the pattern she'd already begun to suspect. The raiders weren't simply feinting and striking at random. They were running a specific, repeating sequence, cycling through 4 coordinated attack vectors in a rotation that, once identified, became almost trivially predictable. "Iyun," Ren called, "they're running a 4-point rotation. Feint north, strike south, feint east, strike west, repeat. If you hold position instead of reacting to the feint, you'll be perfectly placed to intercept the actual strike 2 seconds before it lands." "That contradicts basic threat response doctrine," Iyun said, though something in her voice suggested she was listening despite the doctrinal objection. "I know," Ren said. "Basic threat response doctrine assumes you can't outthink the threat, so you have to outreact it instead. I'm telling you that you can outthink this one, if you're willing to hold still for 2 seconds longer than every instinct in your body is telling you to." There was a pause, and then, with visible reluctance, Squadron Leader Dara Iyun held her position through what should have been an instinctive evasive break, watched the raiders' feint develop exactly as Ren had predicted, and rotated precisely into position to intercept the genuine strike 2 seconds before it would have landed, her weapon's fire catching the attacking fighter directly in its exposed engine housing. "Confirmed kill," Iyun reported, something like disbelief cutting through the tension in her voice. The pattern held exactly as predicted. "It's going to keep holding," Ren said, already relaying the sequence to the other reserve pilots. "They built this whole attack around exploiting how fast Etheri pilots react to individual threats. The second you stop reacting individually and start reading the whole pattern, their entire strategy falls apart." Over the following several minutes, the engagement's shape shifted decisively. Etheri fighters, guided by Ren's patient tracking of the raiders' rotation, began intercepting strikes before they fully developed rather than reacting to them after the fact, while the 4 reserve pilots, moving with the same methodical discipline that had made them, until this moment, the squadron's most consistently overlooked asset, picked off the raiders' formation from angles their reflex-optimized doctrine had never trained them to anticipate. The remaining raiders broke formation and retreated 11 minutes after Ren first identified the rotation pattern, having lost 5 of their 8 fighters to a defense that had, by every measure of Etheri combat doctrine, reacted too slowly to succeed, and had somehow succeeded anyway. The debrief, held 6 hours later once the station's damage had been assessed and its wounded stabilized, was considerably quieter than Ren had expected, given the scale of what had nearly happened. Squadron leader Dara Iyun, her arm in a medical brace from injuries sustained during the engagement's opening minutes, addressed the assembled squadron with an unusual formality. "I have reviewed the full tactical record of today's engagement," she said. "I want to be direct about what it shows. Every Etheri pilot in this squadron, myself included, reacted to individual threats exactly as fast as our physiology and our doctrine trained us to. And every one of us, myself included, was systematically outmaneuvered by an enemy that had studied our doctrine closely enough to exploit its predictability." She paused. Captain Akafa identified that exploitation within the first 90 seconds of engagement, using a methodology our doctrine does not currently teach, and the reversal she enabled is, by any honest assessment, the reason this squadron did not sustain considerably heavier losses today. Flight Instructor Ves Karnal, standing near the back of the assembled squadron, spoke next, and Ren noted, with something between vindication and genuine discomfort, that his usual measured composure had given way to something more uncertain. "I have spent 6 months telling Captain Akafa that reaction speed determines combat effectiveness in this squadron," he said. "I based that assessment on comparative neurology data that is, as far as it goes, entirely accurate. Etheri pilots do process and react to individual threats faster than human pilots, on average, by a wide and measurable margin." He paused. "I did not adequately consider that reaction speed and tactical judgment are not the same capability, and that a doctrine built entirely around the former will always carry a blind spot the latter can exploit. A blind spot, evidently, that today's hostile force understood considerably better than I did." "With respect, Instructor," Ren said, "I don't think the answer is abandoning reflex-based doctrine. Your pilot's reaction speed genuinely won several exchanges today, once they had a pattern worth reacting to quickly. I think the answer is recognizing that speed and judgment solve different problems, and a squadron that only trains for one of them is only ready for half the fights it's actually going to face." Karnal considered this for a long moment. "I would like to propose," he said slowly, "a revision to this squadron's training protocol. Reserve pilot integration into primary combat rotation, not as a contingency measure, but as a standard practice. Specifically, for the tactical judgment your training methodology appears to develop more thoroughly than our own doctrine currently accounts for." Squadron leader Iyun nodded. "I would support that revision. I held position against every instinct in my body today because Captain Akafa asked me to trust a read on the pattern I could not myself see fast enough to identify. I do not believe our squadron survives today's engagement as lightly as it did without that trust, or without the judgment that earned it. Petty Officer Milo Drac found Wren on the hangar deck that evening, running her post-engagement maintenance checks with the same careful, unglamorous thoroughness she brought to everything, despite the fact that her fighter had just been credited with turning the tide of the squadron's most serious engagement in the deployment's 6-month history. "Told you somebody ought to be ready," he said, settling onto a nearby equipment crate. "You did," Wren agreed, not looking up from her diagnostic panel. "I appreciate it, Milo, more than I probably said clearly enough. 6 months of being told I'd never actually fly." "You didn't need to say it clearly," Milo said. "I watched you keep showing up to every simulator drill anyway, every single day, even when nobody with the authority to matter gave any real sign they were watching. That told me everything I needed to know about whether you'd be ready if the day ever came that somebody finally needed you to be." Wren was quiet for a moment, running through the last of her checklist. "Colonel wasn't wrong about the reflex data," she said eventually. "Etheri pilots really are faster than us. That's not going to change, and I don't think it should have to. I just think 6 months of watching that one measurement decide everything about what this squadron thought I was capable of taught me something about what gets overlooked when speed's the only thing anyone's bothering to measure." "What's that?" Wren finally looked up from her panel, considering the question seriously, the way she considered most things about her craft. "Patience," she said, "judgment, the willingness to hold still for 2 seconds longer than every instinct is telling you to, because you've trained yourself to trust the read instead of the reaction. Nobody built a training doctrine around that, because nobody who had 40% faster reflexes ever needed to. But we did. Every human pilot in this squadron built exactly that discipline out of necessity, because it was the only thing we had that Etheri physiology couldn't simply outpace." She closed her diagnostic panel, looked out across the hangar deck at the row of fighters, Etheri and human alike, all of them intact, all of their pilots alive, thanks in no small part to a reserve pilot nobody had expected to matter until the exact moment she did. Turns out that was worth something in the end. "I just wish it hadn't taken an actual attack to get anyone to look for it."